Today, of course, is Easter, the day we celebrate Christ's resurrection. Technically, we should celebrate it every day. That is why Christians began having church to begin with. They started celebrating Christ's resurrection on the first day of the week, and that's why we have church on Sundays. It is a commemoration every Sunday of Christ's resurrection. If you will notice in our gospel reading, and you will notice as we have another reading at the end of the service, the reaction of the people who found out that Jesus had risen from the grave was not loud, boisterous, shouting, dancing, clapping hands and all. They were perplexed. They marveled. They didn't know what was going on. And as you'll hear in the Gospel of Mark in our reading later today, they were afraid. And so although we usually associate Easter with loud music and all this, that, and the other, that was not the reaction that Jesus' resurrection got initially. It was, we don't know what's going on here. People didn't know what to think. And they were afraid. Jesus' resurrection, in the final analysis, is the defeat of death. Over 600,000 Americans die each year of cancer, 650,000 of heart disease, more die of other things, with the result that 3.5 million Americans die each year. That's 1 every 12 seconds. There's no denying death is a fact of life, and we all know it. However, in our day and time, our medical system has allowed us to push our impending death out of our mind. We know we'll die someday. But we depend on the medical system to push it so far back into the future that we don't have to think about it. If something happens to us, we simply go to the doctor, go to whatever specialist, they prescribe a treatment, we get that, we'll get over it and live through it. So we don't have to worry about death anytime soon. One thing, though, that I think came out of the coronavirus episode, and I actually think this is one of the things that created so much panic back then, is we realized that this medical system that we thought that could postpone our lives indefinitely had more limits than we thought it did. We put our trust in the medical system to deliver us from the coronavirus, but we soon found out that was not going to happen. And so, at least for a while during the coronavirus episode, our mortality became more in the forefront of our minds. Now, I think today, with the coronavirus thing sort of having played itself out, our mortality is going back to the back of people's minds. But at least for a year or so, our mortality was more in the forefront. Our mortality is the thing Christianity speaks to. And we have not always been very good at emphasizing that. We have emphasized a lot of other things in Christianity and put that into the background. But the true emphasis of Christianity is the defeat of death. If you look at the Gospels, you will see that all 4 end with Jesus alive after having been crucified. All 4 of them. That's how they end. Now, if you go to the movie, you sit there and you watch the movie, what you take from that movie is the end. Actually, how you feel when you walk out of that movie back to the parking lot depends on how that movie ends. The plot plays out, the movie ends, and you leave. The ending is what gives you the point or the feeling or the main thing you take from that movie. You can look at the Gospels the same way. The Gospels all end with Jesus, who had been crucified, being alive. That's what we take from it. That's what we get up from our seats and go to the parking lot with, that Jesus is alive. It's the main thing. The main thing the Gospels leave with us. Jesus is alive. In Acts chapter 2 is what is called Peter's sermon at Pentecost. This is the first recorded thing the followers of Jesus said after he had ascended into heaven. And if you'll notice what Peter emphasizes, it is the resurrection. It's not the death, it's the resurrection. Acts chapter 4 tells us the message the earliest Christians were preaching. Preaching through Jesus, the resurrection from the dead. Now, why was this so central to them? You know, to us, the resurrection is something we've only heard about. To them, it was something they experienced. It's one thing to hear about something. It's another thing entirely to experience it. You see, they saw Jesus die on the cross. They saw his body taken down. They saw where he was laid in the tomb. And then they saw that tomb empty. And then they saw Jesus, not just once, not just as a spirit, not as an apparition, not as a voice from the sky, but they saw him in his body with the wounds over a 40-day period. They even saw him eat. Over 500 people experienced seeing Jesus after the resurrection. They experienced it. We just heard about it. Think how different it is to experience something than to hear about it. That's what made the resurrection have such an effect on them. It was a turning point for them. It was something they had never seen before, something they would have never thought possible, something they would have just never even imagined. And yet it happened. And it's not that they heard about it happening, they saw it happening. And it changed everything. It changed how they looked at life. It changed how they looked at God. It changed everything. That experience was something that made them look at everything differently. They could never be the same again. And that's why they felt the need to go out and say, look, we experienced this. We saw this. We lived it. The book of 2 Peter says we did not follow cleverly devised stories. We were eyewitnesses. And that's the difference. Today, sadly, in most all forms of institutional Christianity on the denominational level, doesn't matter what denomination, in the major ones, now if you get like to the Church of God or something, this wouldn't happen, but like in Baptist, Methodist, Presbyterian, Episcopal, all this happened. In the upper echelons, especially in the ranks of ministers and denominational officials, you would be hard-pressed to find anyone who really believes that Jesus actually rose from the dead. I was reading something about the United Methodist denomination, and it gave a statistic that 40 years ago, they did a survey among United Methodist ministers. Less than half believed that Jesus had risen from the dead. That was 40 years ago. I don't think you'd find one today. Back then you couldn't admit it. But today, you could. You see, the idea today is that somehow these people who said Jesus rose from the dead simply had some kind of sense that Jesus' spirit was still with them after he died. And then later they came up with the story that Jesus rose from the dead. Why did they come up with that story? We don't know. But they came up with the story. So that's the idea that Christianity puts out today. Why does Christianity put out that? One reason. Because science tells them it would have been impossible for Jesus to rise from the dead. And science is truth with a capital T. Based on what science tells us, there's no other explanation than that these people made all this up. It had to be that way. We know it was that way. It's not that we were there and saw Jesus' body still lying in the tomb and saw these other people going around lying about it. No, that's not. We weren't there. We didn't see it. We know they didn't see it because science says they didn't. And so really, what these modern day Christians are saying is that Christianity is based on lies. It's based on lies. We read over and over again, whenever any new religious survey comes out about how the decline in Christianity is accelerating in the United States, and about how more and more people are turning away from it, and we're supposed to be surprised about that, when even the hierarchy of Christianity itself maintains that the religion of Christianity is based on lies? Are we really supposed to be surprised at that? I do not believe Christianity is based on lies. If I believed that, I would not be here and there would be no Chapel of Christ. Christianity was not born out of people sitting down and thinking up lies. Christianity was born out of experiences people had. Real life events they witnessed with their own eyes. Marvelous things that even they themselves could do. It wasn't people sitting down making things up. It was based on something that happened. And these people knew these things could not be of human origin. They were so different from anything. They had to be of divine origin. They had to have come from God. Whatever was behind all of this was not human. And after experiencing these things, they realized that everything they thought about God, everything they thought about how things work, everything they had always been taught about God and believed about God, all that had to go out the window after what they experienced. They knew they had to rethink everything. And it was not just one little group of people. That extended to many, many people. There were over 500 people who saw Jesus after he was resurrected. They had their lives changed. They could never look at anything the same again. All their beliefs had to change. If you had known someone and you had been over there in the hospital when they died, and you saw the funeral home coming together, and you saw them laying in a casket, and you saw them took over the cemetery and buried, and then you saw them walking down the street one day, what would you think? Think about that for a minute. One of our closest friends, Frank Buff, who was a video participant of the Chapel of Christ for many years, died recently. If I saw Frank Buff walk down that sidewalk out there, I'd have a heart attack. You know, just think about it. What would you think? Somebody that you knew was dead. Somebody that you saw them in the casket living in the grave. What would you think? That's the reaction Easter. You see, it wasn't this loud screaming like Dolly Parton saying he's alive and I'm forgiving him. It was the reaction of somebody seeing Frank Buff walk down that sidewalk down there after I know that he was dead and dead. That's the reaction to Jesus' resurrection. And so those people pondered this, and they eventually realized that what they had witnessed was God coming here to change something. And what they had experienced were the effects of what God was doing in the world. They realized that God had made a deep and eternal change, a deep and eternal effect on things. It was God allowing them to see, just for a moment, the way things really are. All that they used to believe came from what people told them. Now, however, that was thrown out the window. And it was hard to do. If you go through the readings of the Apostle Paul, you see how hard it is in his writings, how hard he struggled trying to let go of Judaism. How hard that was for him. He struggled and struggled and struggled, and he really never did succeed in letting go of all of it. It was a monumental thing to them, though. They eventually realized the fundamental truth about God. God does not want people to die. That was the fundamental truth they recognized out of the resurrection. God does not want people to die. And then they realized that God does not want life to be hard. God does not want life to be full of troubles and heartaches. God does not want life to be full of pain and disappointment and loss. And so God intervened to change things, to get rid of all that. And and they themselves witnessed it. What God had done was about life. The end of death, the end of pain, the end of heartache, the end of trouble. They realized God came here and started a process that eventually would result in everything being made over and all that stuff not a part of. They realized Jesus' resurrection was the turning point in all of human history. Jesus had defeated death, and now God's victory over all the evil powers was assured. Jesus ascended into heaven. He took us there with him. He ascended in his human body. He took his human body to heaven and took us there with him. He removed us from the bad things here. He set us in heaven with him. You see, God rescued us out of the world. The real meaning of the word is translated as save or salvation in the New Testament. It's really more accurately translated as rescue. See, Jesus rescues us not from sin, but from the world. He rescues us from sin in the sense that he rescues us from evil. He rescues us from the evil that's everywhere in the world. And now we are no longer chained to the earth. We are no longer chained to a life of hardship and trouble. We are no longer chained to face the end of existence. We have been elevated above and beyond all that. We are already citizens of heaven. We are sons and daughters of God. The resurrection of Jesus is not just a man rising from the dead. It changed who we are. It made us more than just creatures of the earth. It made us creatures of heaven. It took us out of this world full of hardship and pain and disappointment and loss and all kinds of bad things. And it put us ultimately in a world where none of that will be able to touch us. The resurrection allows us to see God as the God of life. Not life as we know it today, but life perfected. It allows us to see God as the one who reaches down and grabs us out of the pit of this world and rescues us and takes us with him. The resurrection is why we can live today in the mess, the absolute mess that is out in the world, and we live in it with our shoulders squared and our head held high because Jesus is the victor, and he gives us a share in his victory. Thanks be to God who gives us the victory through our Lord Jesus Christ.